Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am coordinating the paper on Sociology in India. Today we are going to discuss the topic Contested Modernity. This module has been written by A. Apurva, Research Scholar, Department of Sociology, Binghamton University, State University of New York. In this module, we are going to discuss the concept of modernity, especially in terms of its relation to how it has been conceptualized in the West. We will also discuss the whole idea of colonial modernity, especially with regard to Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru on the contested terrain of modernity. We will also understand the relationship of modernity and knowledge, especially in terms of power. And finally, we will also understand the relationship of globalization and modernity, and also the challenges of the crisis of secularism that it poses for modernity in India. Objective: the module is meant to discuss and analyze the debates surrounding questions about the onset and spread of modernity in India. The objective is to understand India's critical response and troubled relationship with institutions and practices of modernity. Introduction. The title of this module, Contested Modernity, indicates an unresolved and disputed state of what Chakravarti terms habitations of modernity in India. One may ask why there is no clear consensus among scholars and intellectuals on a seemingly straightforward question: what constitutes modernity or what qualifies as modern in the case of India? Even a commonsensical answer to such a question comes with its own baggage of tradition. In such a words, it resonates in the public domain as India or Indians being modern yet traditional, or a blend of modernity and tradition. Let us take a cue from this commonsensical answer, which suggests that modernity and tradition are not completely antagonistic to each other. They do not constitute mutually exclusive domains in India, as they perhaps did in Europe during the Enlightenment. In Europe, modernity emerged out of Enlightenment movement from the 17th century onwards and received philosophical and intellectual attention that defined European modernity as a new mode of being represented by modern institutions and practices against the then existing European tradition, argues Giddens. In this context, the module will first discuss the development of Western European modernity as a distinctive mode of social life and how it spread to the rest of the world primarily through the vessels of colonial rule. Once it reached the shores of so-called traditional society under the garb of the civilizing mission, indigenous scholars engaged with the idea of European modernity and elicited a wide range of responses. Therefore, second in the Indian context, we will discuss Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru's distinct approach to the question of colonial modernity and the effects and echoes of their voices heard in future debates on post-colonial modernity. Third, this module will delineate and analyze the equation of knowledge and power and the way it shaped and structured colonial institutions and practices, especially the way it shaped modern disciplines of sociology, anthropology and science in general. And finally, the way later indigenous traditional knowledge emerged against this dominant Eurocentric perspective. The fourth part of the module engages with the troubling relationship of modernity and secularism and religious fundamentalism. In contemporary times, this pressing issue unravels further dilemmas and ambiguities attached to the concept of modernity. In the final section, the module draws towards contemporary practices of globalization and meanings of global modernity in India. Modernity and West. Modern literally means pertaining to current age or period. However, beginning in the 19th century, it specifically caters to a distinct mode of social life, knowledge, values, institutions and practices that emerged in Western Europe. During that time, as Wallerstein argues, modernity had two widely accepted meanings. One represented scientific and technological advancement and progress encapsulated in the process of modernization, whereas the other meaning expressed itself in the terms of human liberation and freedom and was embedded in the ideas of reason, justice, equality and humanism. A question emerges: how to differentiate modern social institutions from the traditional ones? Giddens asserted that modernity in comparison to tradition signified greater pace of change with respect to technology, intensified scope of change with global interconnections and created new political systems articulated in the nation state and introduced wage labor as a condition of capitalist system. From a sociological point of view, Karl Marx identified capitalism as a transformative and central force shaping modern society along with commodification of labor power, alienation, and the class struggle between antagonistic modern classes, the bourgeois and the proletariat. In comparison, for Emile Durkheim, it was industrialism, division of labor, social solidarity and harmony that was central to an emerging modern society rather than capitalist competition and exploitation. Additionally, a third important intellectual figure of this time, Max Weber, characterized rationalization and bureaucratization as the key factors to understand an emerging modern European society. Both Durkheim and Marx had divergent views on modern society. Nonetheless, both believed in two meanings of modernity mentioned above, that is, modernity as a way to technological and scientific progress and modernity as a way to achieve human liberation and freedom. In other words, Durkheim saw expansion of industrialism, technological progress as a way forward to harmonious social life, whereas Marx envisaged technological progress of the capitalist system leading to a condition of class struggle which in turn would create a more humane and liberated society. Weber in comparison agreed with the first meaning of modernity as a condition of technological and material advancement but disagreed with the second meaning of modernity. In his pessimistic worldview, he argued that the modern process of rationalization and bureaucratization restricted human freedom and individual autonomy. Looking historically, it becomes evident that the two meanings of modernity, scientific and technological advancement and human emancipation, have remained in a frictional relationship with each other as European colonization, world wars, the Holocaust, genocides and unfulfilled promises of the left socialist communist ideology marred most of the 20th century. These instances led academic scholars to question two claims of European modernity: its technical and scientific superiority and its potential universal applicability to all societies. It is true that modernity as a distinctive mode of social life emerged in local European context, but it is also true that its institutions, practices and values have affected and reshaped to varying degrees the ideological and intellectual framework of the entire world. In that sense, modernity has a global appeal, but it has not yet been completely successful in erasing particularities of other cultural and social life, argues Chakrabarti. Its superiority and universalist claims have been contested, appropriated, negotiated, debunked and critiqued as it travelled to other parts of the world. Let us turn to some debates and discussions regarding the effects and contours of modernity in India. Colonial modernity. The term colonial modernity refers to the existence of modernity in the colony and experience of modernity under colonialism. Though still matters of debate, some Indian scholars understand colonial modernity as a compromise between European modernity and indigenous traditions, and they examine the universal claims of modernity, equality, liberty, freedom, individual rights that manifested itself in contradictory ways in colonial India. In this context, subaltern scholar Ranajit Guha shows how modern colonial reformist tone failed to dismantle pre-colonial institutions and practices. For example, the professed equality imagined between modern legal system, particularly towards colonized subjects, often in practice subordinated such egalitarian values to pre-existing in egalitarian caste and religious systems. Similarly, for many subaltern scholars, colonial modernity became a curious quest to make sense of the social and cultural groups that constantly question modernity's distinction between rational and irrational, the secular and the sacred, argues Chakrabarti. Today, we have an academic vantage point to understand the rhetoric of the universal modernist project and to critically examine its claim. But until the 1970s, European modernity and the American model of modernization were uncritically accepted by newly independent countries. It was a seminal work of Frantz Fanon, The Wreck of the Earth, English translation in 2004, and Edward Said's Orientalism 1978, which raised the questions about purported supremacy of European modernity. In India, the subaltern studies scholars and post-colonial critics have similarly raised important questions regarding many dubious claims of modernity. These scholars employed a critical stance towards modernity to closely examine the relationship between colonial power and distribution of knowledge. In this regard, they examine how disciplines such as history, anthropology or sociology got institutionalized in colleges and universities as part of the colonial modernist project, and how in turn the project created an ideological framework of false binary, modernity versus tradition, in which many scholarly works were found to be trapped. The module will come back to discuss the contours and contents of these debates, but before that, let us understand the engagement and response of three important political figures, Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru, with colonial modernity and the contributions towards the making of ideas of India. Gandhi, Ambedkar, Nehru on contested terrain of modernity. While M.K. Gandhi rejected Western modernity, B.R. Ambedkar realized his potential for emancipation for the untouchable caste, though it was Jawaharlal Nehru who put faith in the temples of modern India as decolonization unfolded as a historical process of becoming modern after the British Raj ended. Let us deliberate on each of them in some detail because their thoughts on Western modernity and modernization have implications for the current debates about tradition and modernity in India. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi presents his critique of modern civilization and modernity. Gandhi argues against industrial civilization and technological advancement. He cites the inherent ills and violence perpetuated by scientific rationality and questions the idea of progress and the speed of modern society. Gandhi attaches a moral superiority to an ancient Indian civilization and argues in Hind Swaraj that modern science and technology has eroded the traditional morality of Hindu society. Thus, he reimagines a Swaraj self-rule adorned with simplicity, austerity, ahimsa, with a slow pace of life. The political, social and economic aesthetics of Gandhi helps him to envisage a self-sufficient village life where decentralized political structures, panchayat, communal harmony and Swadeshi cooperative economy based on the needs take precedence over pleasure and desire created by Western modernity. In this way, Gandhi aimed to restore a traditional Indian identity as a spiritual nation devoid of modern values, money, machinery and pleasure. Unceremoniously, after independence, Gandhi's ideals and arguments against modern civilization were swept under the rug by Nehruvian state in an attempt to make India modern. However, in the last 2 to 3 decades, Gandhian ideas and methods have resurfaced in the intellectual circle as an alternative to the excesses of modern capitalism and environmental degradation. We will discuss this below, but let us focus on two elements of tradition, religion and caste, which served modern functions in Gandhi's thought and practice. Gandhi lived not only as a deeply religious person but consciously merged religion with politics as a strategic move for mass mobilization against colonial rule. Gandhi's secular aura was not devoid of religion, rather his interpretation of the religious texts taught him the value of humanity, the importance of non-violence and satyagraha, truth force, which he used instrumentally and not only to fight the British rule but also to quell communal tensions between Hindus and Muslims. In other words, Gandhi used traditional elements, that is combination of religion and politics and asceticism, to shake the foundation of imperialism. Gandhi's strategy against the imperial force was completely different than the proposed modern secular revolutionary strategy of Marx and Lenin. Gandhi's ultimate goal was to build Ram Rajya, with Bhagavad Gita being the spiritual mooring of that society. Perhaps it is this logic in Gandhi that wished to retain some elements of a traditional caste system, of course without untouchability. Gandhi's effort to eradicate untouchability and his dedication to solemnize intercaste marriage is beyond question, but it is also true that he never explicitly rejected his beliefs in the traditional Varna system. Gandhi's views on tradition and modernity did not go uncontested, and his contemporary Ambedkar challenged Gandhi's views on religion, Hinduism, caste and the ideal of village society and became Gandhi's biggest critic, argues Roy. Unlike Gandhi, Ambedkar's social and political framework relies on the European Enlightenment project, in which triumph of reason separated modern from traditional India. For Ambedkar, modern reason and traditional morality were two mutually exclusive domains in which traditional ways of life need to be rejected if it is not incompatible with reason, argues Rodrigues. Historically, for Ambedkar, the modern age of reason is advancement over the traditional age filled with myths and superstition, and therefore he accuses Gandhi of taking Indian society back to the dark ages of tradition. Contrary to Gandhi, Ambedkar believed in an enlightened India which would practically embrace European Enlightenment thought, liberalism and the idea of progress. It is in this spirit, he writes, that Gandhi's ideal village was a sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness and communalism. An enlightened India should aspire for urbanism, modernism and industrialism. Similarly, if Gandhi endorsed a caste system in some form, Ambedkar called for complete annihilation of it. In his seminal text, Annihilation of Caste, he put forth a radical criticism of the dominance of Brahmanism and the influence of Hindu Shastras on traditional society that consciously and historically relegated untouchables to a socially inferior position. In this sense, according to Ambedkar, caste inequality need not be rationalized just because Hindu Shastras mentioned it. Though he rejected Hinduism, Ambedkar was ambivalent about religion, argues Rodrigues. On the one hand, he showed skeptical attitude towards superstition and myths attached to religion. On the other, he affirmed significance of a religion in a Durkheimian sense as means of social solidarity and as a way to evaluate the importance of reason. Though Gandhi had immense personal and political influence on Nehru, like Ambedkar, he was not completely persuaded by Gandhi's negative assessment of modernity. A self-proclaimed agnostic and secular socialist, Nehru was devoted to developing India in line with modern democracies, where industries, dams, scientific temperament and technological advancement would prevail against a Gandhian social and economic vision. Nehru assumed that the path of economic modernization would lead to an inevitable weakening of traditional holds of religion and caste. Though Nehru assessed the irrelevance of religion and caste from a modernist lens, it is difficult to conclude he was a modernist in the true Western sense. Rather, he had one foot grounded firmly in the ideas and methods of Western modernity, whereas his other foot searched for moral and ethical stability in the Indian traditional values. In Discovery of India, Nehru concluded that modern Western industrial society had valued excessive individualism over social and moral values. Therefore, according to Nehru, it would be imperative for India to expand the concept of modernity to include moral as well as material elements in the framework of economic modernization. Politically, Nehru appropriated the modern state and democratic framework from the West in anticipation that pluralism and secularism would explore its true meanings in the nation state, India, threatened by homogenizing forces of Hindu ideologies of that time. In this sense, Nehruvian modernity carved the idea of India, which was diverse and modern in its own way. The terrain of modernity is fraught with disagreements as evident in the thoughts of Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru. The divergent viewpoints on what is modernity, what constitutes modernity in India and where to locate tradition and indignity in overarching European modernity did greatly inform future debates. Let us further explore these discussions and debates surrounding modernity, the emergence and distribution of modern knowledge and its relationship to power. Modernity and knowledge power. Since the late 1970s, post-colonial scholars exploring the contours of European modernity have studied the relationship between modern knowledge and power and debated the legacy of European enlightenment in the case of India. Such debates have taken place under the rubric of Eurocentrism, universalism and particularism, modern European knowledge and indigenous knowledge system, scientific temper and humanistic temper. The consequence of debating the legacy of European modernity has created further anxiety around modernizing of India, but at the same time it has also helped to form a confident scholarship that aims for reflexivity and diversity in the field of knowledge, argues Patel. Modernity and sociology in India. Colonial modernity created disciplinary divisions of knowledge in which sociological theories and methods were developed to study modern, hence modernity, European societies, whereas anthropological perspectives and its methods were designed to study particular pre-modern colonial societies, in other words, societies waiting to be modern. This Eurocentric binary construction is closely tied to the distribution of power between the colonizer and colonized, which had implications on the way sociology and social anthropology developed in India. The implication can be seen in two arenas. First, the disciplinary boundary between sociology and anthropology remained fuzzy, and more often than not, the former found its representation in the latter. It is in this blurred disciplinary boundary that the colonial administration and trained anthropologists studied India to classify and categorize groups and communities under primordial identities of caste, tribe, kinship and religion. Second, the disciplinary and epistemic practices of anthropology developed a framework that conceptualized various regional groups and communities in relation to Hindu civilization and invariably equated India with Hinduism, and thereby produced Indian tradition as distinct from the West, as argued by Patel. For example, G.S. Ghure, the father of Indian sociology, perceived Indian Hindu civilizational questions through Indological approach. After independence, the colonial binary of modernity tradition was reframed and re-articulated in the then dominant model of American sociology, modernization theory. This evolutionary stage of theory emphasized studying erstwhile traditional and colonial societies which were behind and yet to be modern in relation to American modernity. Thus, the existing and emerging institutions in newly independent India now had a goal of becoming modern, which led to a new generation of sociologists, social anthropologists to focus on examining the process of industrialization, urbanization and modernization of Indian tradition as the surest way to move towards modernity. The external theoretical and methodological model of modernization became the way to organize sociology in India. Sociology in Indian universities that relied more on mirroring the West and reflecting on the received model for knowledge building in sociology and related disciplines. During this period, sociologist, social anthropologist M. N. Srinivas tried to develop an indigenous perspective based on ethnography and insider's view. Srinivas kept the adaptive caste system central to his functionalist analysis for understanding the changing India. Nevertheless, his brand of anthropological methods and traditional themes, his brand of sociology, social anthropology focused exclusively on anthropological methods and traditional themes, caste, kinship, religion, which had two consequences. It hindered theoretical such as class analysis and methodological such as quantitative method development of the discipline, and two, it remained non-reflexive towards the project of modernity, since post-independent sociological and anthropological study kept its focus on understanding tradition which was constructed by colonial modernity in the first place, argues Patel. For the present generation of sociologists, the task is precisely this: how to go beyond this binary of modernity and tradition constructed by the colonial power and practiced by national indigenous sociology, and how to build a diverse self-reflexive sociologies that fulfill the promise of sociological imagination. In this context, the post-colonial critics such as Partha Chatterjee, Dipesh Chakravarti do provide a way to reframe and re-articulate social sciences in the era of globalization. The task is difficult, though not impossible. It is difficult because in the current era of globalization, the restructuring of knowledge is taking place, and like its predecessor, modernization theorists, the Western scholars, are busy reframing new trap of binaries. For example, Samuel Huntington's class of civilizational thesis has reconstructed a new us, modern Western Euro-American secular versus them, traditional non-Western religious, but its claims are fiercely contested by the new generations of social scientists. Modern scientific temper and people's science. In Discovery of India, Nehru wrote, "Scientific temper is a temper of free man." This idea of scientific temper and scientific rationality came under assault in 1980s when post-colonial critics such as Ashish Nandi launched a counter-argument to claim that ultimate logic of scientific temper is vulgar contempt for the common man it excludes. This counter-statement against the scientific temper called for a humanistic temper, and this clash of tempers represented another disputed ground of European legacy of modernity in India. The contested question is, should we simply appropriate modern Western science for India's development, or should we have our own indigenous science and knowledge catering to the local needs? In academic circles, the argument by science studies and counter-argument by post-colonial studies is portrayed as science wars, argues Nanda, where significance of scientific reasoning and faith in tenets of enlightenment has met its nemesis in the cultural critique of scientific temper. On the one hand, science studies imbued with scientific temper aims at disseminating scientific explanations and rationality among traditional people so that people can liberate themselves from the clutches of superstition and irrationality, evaluate the significance of values, and use science to end injustice. On the other hand, post-colonial studies questions the objectivity, value neutrality, and progressive stance of Western science and technology, which has historically been used to dominate the colonial world, justify racism through scientific racism, argued for inferiority of colonial subjects, and to perpetuate violence on traditional natural habitation of people in post-independence period. Thus, this position viewed science not only as one of the many ways of knowing, but also wanted to recognize science as culture. Broaching Gandhi's anti-Western stance, the new perspective on science argued for a decolonization of mind and proposed the use of science and technology towards humanistic end. It is in this context that one can understand the emergence of indigenous people's science movements such as Kerala Shastra Sahitya Parishad, Patriotic People for Science and Technology, Kishore Bharati, Chipko Andolan, Jan Vikas Andolan, Narmada Bachao Andolan, National Alliance of People's Movement, and so on. The famous social scientist personalities attached to these movements and alternative sciences are Ashish Nandi, Vandana Shiva, Medha Patkar, Claude Alvarez, and Shiv Viswanathan, who work to spread traditional science and knowledge at the grassroots level. One can draw a few conclusions and raise some questions in the context of this relationship between modernity and science in India. One, as post-colonial studies suggest, when thinking about modern science and its impact on society, one should pay attention to the role of society, culture, gender, class, and race and caste in producing scientific activities. 2. The people science movement and post-colonial critique of scientific temper is not against science per se, but they are against the social, cultural, and political hegemony of science. 3. While posing against modern European science, is indigenous and traditional science recreating the old binary? Perhaps the answer lies in an honest, critical, and rigorous evaluation of received knowledge irrespective of the source of that knowledge. 4. Do critiques of modern science and arguments for indigenous science means one ends up supporting the cause and ethos of Hindu nationalists who glorify Hindu tradition and science? Let us explore this question in the next section. Modernity and the crisis of secularism. One of the pillars of European modernity was the idea of secularism that grew in opposition to religious domination of pre-modern society. The modern European secular state claimed to guarantee religious freedom, maintain neutrality in religious affairs, and honor the separation of politics from religious institutions. In the context of India, vagueness attached to secularism is profound. Nonetheless, the Nehruvian state did profess religious freedom as one of the emblems of constitutional rights and did desire to form a separate domain for politics and religion. However, the Indian state's dubious role in post-independence communal violence, its suggested role in minority appeasement, its involvement in regulating and funding of religious institutions, and emergence of a new political force in the form of Hindu right, the Bharatiya Janata Party, has created an anti-secular environment since 1980s, argues Chatterjee. Criticism against secularism was advanced academically as well as politically. In academia, Ashish Nandy opened a line of intellectual attack on secularism by putting forth his anti-secular manifesto. Similarly, sociologist T.N. Madan also argued in favor of abandoning the secular project as he saw no difference between religious fundamentalists and secularists who were completely against the existence of religion in people's life. Politically, the Hindu right, the Sangh Parivar, raised his voice against the idea of secularism, which they interpreted as a pro-Muslim stand. Thus, Enlightenment ideology of secularism received strong criticism from both post-colonial scholars and cultural nationalists, which made them strange bedfellows, both arguing and aspiring for the cultural authenticity and anti-secularism. In other words, the left-leaning secular scholars who believed in the value of Enlightenment, rationalism and secularism argued that a critique of modernity by post-colonial scholars and forms of indignity they advocated made it difficult to differentiate between them and aspirations of Hindutva forces, especially works of Sarkar and Nanda. Does this mean that post-colonial scholars indirectly endorse and take what might be politically irresponsible positions? The post-colonial response to this accusation is this: religion is an integral part of people's everyday life, and the European legacy of separation between sacred and secular does not hold too strong a ground in India. However, the way academic secular discourse, particularly Indian Marxism, developed first under colonial power structures and later under independence, continued to emphasize the separation of religious from political institutions. The secular modernist framework relegated question of religion, rituals, God and superstition as a relic of the past. In other words, the modern secular academic discourse did not pay attention to the questions related to religion because it did not quite fit into their frame of analysis. Such hostility in secular academic discourse towards religion has itself been a result of between sacred tradition and secular modern, despite strong empirical reality of modern India's deeply religious life. Further, on questions of being politically irresponsible, sympathetic to Hindutva anti-minority rhetoric, post-colonial scholars argue that studying religious attitude of mass does not make one an automatic supporter of Hindu fascist tendencies. Moreover, Nandi argues that modern secular discourse fails analytically to separate traditional faith and religious ideology and collapses lived faith into religious ideology. In Nandi's interpretation, modernity is dominated by religious ideology, unlike traditional faith of tolerance, and modern institutions and organizations use this religious ideology to achieve parochial political ends. The post-colonial scholars pose counter questions to secular intellectuals. Can we educate people to become non-religious, or should we see a modernity as distorted, inferior and incomplete since aims of secularism remain unfulfilled? The truth is that contestation over meaning, substances and institutions of modernity in India have raised more questions than definite and clear answers. However, one should remember that raising questions about modernity or Enlightenment rationalism is not to reject all aspects of that rationalism. Moreover, Nandi argues that modern secular discourse fails analytically to separate traditional faith and religious ideology and collapses lived faith into religious ideology. In Nandi's interpretation, modernity is dominated by religious ideology, unlike traditional faith of tolerance, and modern institutions and organizations use this religious ideology to achieve parochial political ends. Post-colonial scholars pose counter questions to secular intellectuals. Can we educate people to become non-religious, or should we use a modernity as a distorted, inferior and incomplete since aims of secularism remain unfulfilled? The truth is that contestation over meaning, substances and institutions of modernity in India have raised more questions than definite and clear answers. However, one should remember that raising questions about modernity on Enlightenment rationalism is not to reject all aspects of that rationalism and fall into the abysses of irrationalism. Globalization of modernity. Is it an interconnected world of globalization that allows movement of capital, people, goods and services, slowly creating a homogeneous experience of modernity? Or does modernity remain a diverse experience appropriated by different populations despite an all-encompassing globalization? One theoretical stand represented most in the work of American sociologist George Ritzer indeed argued that modernity's underlying rationalization process is slowly creating a world as a more homogeneous place, and that the dimensions terms of rationalization such as efficiency, predictability, calculability, control and use of non-human technology are all making global modernity's experience far too similar. In this perspective, Max Weber's formal rationality as a way of social, political and economic organization is coming to dominate most of the world's already evident in the way fast food restaurant, shopping malls, gated communities, packaged tours, consumer culture are managed and operated in the globalized era. The other theoretical position takes an oppositional stance and interprets modernity as a Western category and also as an instant of varied global experience that exists everywhere. It asserts that in the era of globalization, the ascendancy of mass media and mass migration has affected people's imagination about what to consume, when to consume and the extent to consume or even a refusal to consume. At the same time, it also provides them with means for local production of modernity, which is different from the Euro-American form of modernity. In other words, contemporary mass media and mass migration have slowly started to deterritorialize people, leading to a complex and overlapping disjunction in various aspects of economic, political and cultural life. In this situation, there exist tensions and contradictions between local and global cultural processes which create a new public culture where the experience of modernity can be contested, interrogated, negotiated and appropriated differently as argued by Appadurai. Conclusion: modernity since its inception had sought to universalize itself through the process of colonization, modernization and globalization. India has been under the spell of modernity since colonial times, and the two meanings associated with modernity, scientific and technological advancement and human liberation, have generated complex, varied and often anxious responses in India. For example, Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru respectively opposed, supported and institutionalized modernity in India. When the question of modernity reached academic corridors, some of the early liberal and Marxist scholars either readily identified with the project of modernity, science, reason, development and emancipation, or emphasize the counter project of tradition, caste, tribe, kinship, religion. Such academic enterprises legitimize the binary of modernity and tradition, thus interpreted India either as yet to be modern, an incomplete modernity, or a civilizational guru with a repository of valuable indigenous knowledge. These intellectual positions had its flaws and in the sense were the result of the structure of knowledge constructed during the colonial times. At present, it is this binary created by colonial power that needs to be transcended. On the contested terrain of modernity, critical sociologists and post-colonial scholars do provide us with a way to do that by imagining a critical, diverse and reflexive modernity. In this module on contested modernity, it becomes very clear that the idea of modernity is always understood within the binary of tradition. It is very important to go beyond the binary of tradition and modernity and understand modernity in terms of a reflexive ideology. In that sense, the works of the scholars are very important because it is still too early to understand what exactly modernity still means in India today. Thank you.